Okay, so we've talked about the federal district court and what that court does, and then what the circuit court does. And so now let's talk about how a case might work its way up all the way to the United States Supreme Court. When the circuit court makes its decision and affirms or reverses or maybe even remands the case back down to the trial court, after that happens, one of the parties may again feel that the court has made a mistake. This time it may feel that the appellate court, the circuit court, has made a mistake in its decision. If that happens, the party may want the decision to be reviewed by the United States Supreme Court. And so the party may ask the Supreme Court to review that decision. But unlike going from the district court to the circuit court, a party doesn't have the right to appeal the decision up to the Supreme Court. There's no automatic right of appeal to the Supreme Court. The party that wants the circuit court decision to be reviewed by the Supreme Court has to do something special. It has to file something called a petition for a writ of certiorari. Petition for a writ of certiorari. And that's just a fancy way of saying a request for a review. It's asking the Supreme Court, please could you review the decision of the circuit court. We sometimes call this a cert petition for short. Cert is just short for certiorari petition. So when the cert petition is filed and submitted to the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court has to decide what to do with this cert petition. Now, the way that the Supreme Court works is that it receives all of these cert petitions every year and has to decide which of these cases it wants to review. There are thousands of cert petitions that are submitted to the Supreme Court. And because the Supreme Court is just one court, it can't possibly review all of them. Now, the Supreme Court, though it's just one court, is made up of 9 judges. We call them justices, 9 Supreme Court justices. There's 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. So these 9 justices make up the Supreme Court. And when they receive a cert petition, they decide whether that case is worth the Supreme Court's time to review. And because the Supreme Court is deciding whether to review a lower court's decision, we say that the Supreme Court also has appellate jurisdiction. But because it gets to decide which ones it wants to review, we say that it has discretionary appellate jurisdiction. Discretionary appellate jurisdiction. Now, technically, the Supreme Court also has original jurisdiction for some cases. For example, if the lawsuit is actually between 2 states, so if the states of California and Oregon had a dispute about their boundary lines, well, it wouldn't really seem fair to have that case brought in the district court of a state, because that would seem to give one state an advantage. If the case were brought in the Northern District of California, that might seem to give an advantage to the state of California. And on the other hand, if it were in the district court of the District of Oregon, that might seem to give Oregon an advantage. And so in cases like that, the Supreme Court actually has original jurisdiction. But even then, the parties need to usually ask for permission to file that complaint with the Supreme Court. In any event, it's pretty rare. Usually the Supreme Court just exercises its discretionary appellate jurisdiction. So when the justices receive the cert petition, they decide whether that particular case is worth their review. And if 4 of the Supreme Court justices, any 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, if 4 of them decide that the case is important enough to the overall legal system in the country, then they will agree to review the case. And we say in that case that the Supreme Court will grant cert. It will grant review. But if there aren't at least 4 Supreme Court justices who feel that the case is worth reviewing, then we say that the Supreme Court will deny cert. It denies review. Now, if the Supreme Court denies cert, then the case just ends in the circuit court. Then the decision of the circuit court is the end of the story. There's no more appeal, no more review. But if the Supreme Court grants cert, then the Supreme Court will review the decision of the circuit court, again, to make sure that it applied the law correctly, or that it even applied the correct law to begin with. So that's the role of the Supreme Court in the federal court system.